The reason ISO is one of the three camera and being able to take steps. Nope, cut.
Welcome. My name is Victor Malice, and I have been mastering photography for the past 3 years. And I'm here to share some tips and tricks with you that were so freely given to me back when I first started my photography journey. I hope you find great value in my video, and if you're interested in more content, subscribe. Now, today we're going to talk about ISO, commonly referred to as ISO. And you can say ISO or ISO, either one is fine. So what is ISO? Well, the acronym stands for International Standards Organization, which is a group who do exactly what the name suggests, set standards for certain values that haven't been standardized, if that makes sense. So what is it when it relates to photography, and why should you care? Now, this may contradict what you've been previously told. ISO does not impact the amount of light that hits your sensor. Give me a chance to explain. So unlike aperture, which opens and closes a physical ring inside your lens, causing either more or less light to get in, and unlike the shutter, which is a physical curtain that opens and closes inside your camera body, exposing the sensor to more or less light depending on how long it's open, ISO is your sensor's sensitivity to light. Try saying that 5 times fast. Well, ISO is one of the 3 pillars of photography responsible for helping you get a properly exposed photo. Exposure, as it relates to photography, refers to the brightness of your photo. Now, I'm willing to bet you have one of these. The camera in your smartphone is set to basically an automatic mode. Part of the reason it's so easy is because the camera is automatically adjusting ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, all in an effort to get the best exposure possible. Now listen, composition is important, subject matter is important, but proper exposure will always be the foundation of a great photo. I'll give you an example. Let's say someone looks at your photo and the first thing they notice is how dark it is, or that the sun has kind of taken over and washed out the colors and the shadows. Understandably, it's going to be pretty tough for them to see past that into what your true intention of the photo was. The idea that you always need to shoot at as low an ISO possible has been around since camera companies first started letting us manually control ISO. And if you've done any research into photography, or at least the basics of photography, I'm sure you've heard that take. Now, when I first started out, I fell into that trap. And even when I found myself needing higher exposure and bumping it up a little bit, it almost felt like I was going against a deep-seated value. It was a weird time. When your photo is really dark at the time that you take it, meaning it's not properly exposed, and you're thinking, I need to shoot in the lowest ISO possible because I want the clearest, sharpest image I can get, plus I can just bump it up in post, the problem you run into is that you'll end up introducing noise and grain in the photo anyways. And on top of that, sometimes the details in the shadows aren't preserved. So when you go to bump up your exposure in post, you run into an even bigger problem. Now you're not just working with noise reduction tools, you're also working with a photo that lost some of the details that you were hoping to catch in the first place. So back to what it is. It's more of a dial for your sensor that tells it how much light to absorb. The lower the ISO, the less sensitive it's going to be to light. Transversely, the higher the ISO, the greater the sensitivity to light. So how do you properly expose your photos? That's a good question. I'm going to go ahead and say all cameras have an exposure meter to some degree or another. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. The exposure meter exists to help you see if you've got too little or too much light in any given photo. Now, as we look through my viewfinder, you can see down at the bottom is the exposure meter. It's the numbers that count backwards from 5 and then up to 5. Now, the bottom right corner, you can see I've got my ISO. You'll also notice what's called a histogram. Now, the histogram is a visual representation of highlights and shadows, and it can be very helpful when trying to properly expose your photo. You can see when I've got it at the lower ISO, the histogram is all bunched up on the left. As I gradually increase the ISO, the histogram starts to spread out, giving a more balanced wave. You'll also see a little down arrow on the exposure meter, moving up each time I increase the ISO. When that arrow gets to 0, that's what your camera believes to be the best exposure for that image. Now, it's not a fail-safe. Especially if your shot has a lot of highlights and shadows in many different places. It's meant to be used as more of a guide. Now, I don't want you coming back here saying, but Victor told me, because I'm also telling you to trust your eyes. So what the exposure meter is doing is it's trying to balance the highlights and the shadows, all in an effort to help you get a good exposure for your photo. Now I'm going to show you an example of how ISO affects your exposure and why it's important to expose properly the first time. Now I want you to keep in mind this is an extreme example, but I think it perfectly highlights the importance of proper exposure over the low ISO myth. So the first photo was taken at a lower ISO, 2500, to preserve the detail, shot with a higher shutter speed and a higher aperture. The second photo was taken at ISO 12,800 with a lower shutter speed and a lower aperture. First thing you notice right off the bat, one of these photos is properly exposed, or at least exposed enough to where I don't have to boost the exposure a ton in post. The other photo, you can barely see. So when I go to raise the exposure to try to match the properly exposed photo, this is what happens. Now when we're looking at the properly exposed photo, you can see that yeah, there is still noise, but it's a usable photo. And with post-editing noise reduction tools, this photo will look great. So when we look at the photo on the left, the one that isn't exposed properly, we've got a bigger issue. The photo on the left has so much noise and grain that it's actually started to lose some of that detail when you take a step back. So do you see the issue that you tend to run into when you're not exposing properly? Again, yes, I know this is an extreme case, but it's a good example of why it matters. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong impression. There are situations where using a lower ISO is absolutely the way to go. I just don't want you to get stuck in that same mindset that I got stuck in. So let's look through some examples of photos I took at lower ISOs. Here we've got my ever so patient, beautiful fiance. This was shot during golden hour. Perfect example of proper exposure with ISO 100. The focus is right on her eye and tack sharp where it needs to be. Now this second shot I took during an adventure in downtown St. Paul. This is the Capitol building. This one was also shot at ISO 100, and when I zoom in you can see it's clean and well exposed. Now this third photo, we've got another shot during golden hour. If you're not sure what that is, it's what many people refer to as the best time of the day to take photos, sunrise or sunset, because the sun is giving off this beautiful natural glow, which translates to incredible looking skin tones for portraits, which is primarily what I shoot. But again, shot at a lower ISO, really clean. Now in this fourth photo, I sat this couple down next to a large window when it was much colder than we anticipated outside. You see, I think part of photography is learning to adapt to your surroundings. Whether that's light, weather, unruly toddlers, you gotta be able to pivot and be flexible so you can still get great photos. And this is regardless of your subject. Again, this one was shot at a lower ISO. Last but certainly not least, I want to show you what noise reduction software can do for your photo in post-production in case you're still skeptical about shooting with higher ISOs. Now I properly exposed this photo by boosting my ISO up to 3200. When I zoom in is when you can start to see the noise and the grain. Lightroom, which is the editing software that I use, recently introduced this AI noise reduction function, and I want to show you what it does. So here we have a side-by-side comparison. You can see when I zoom in that there isn't any contest in regards to which one is cleaner. There are many different softwares you can use. Personally, I find the Lightroom AI noise reduction tool makes the photos a little too smooth, almost plasticky. But when I zoom out, I just love the natural look of his sweatshirt in the original photo. So to recap, ISO is your sensor's sensitivity to light. Exposing your photo properly is far more important than shooting at lower ISOs. Noise isn't the end of the world. If it's getting in the way of your photo, there is plenty of software that can help reduce it. I'm new to the YouTube creator world, but I plan on making videos as often as I can. And if you found any value in this video, I greatly appreciate likes and comments, questions, so go ahead and click that subscribe button for more in-depth videos about basic photography. Thanks for sticking around. I'll see you later.